Alright, what's up again, fellow party people? It's a fucking great morning time right now. You can see up in the sky the cloud cover. It's great today, again. So there's been two people in the last 2 days that have brought up to me that they really enjoy watching the clouds and the shapes and shit that unfold inside of there. To the point where, they think there's something to be had by watching those phenomena and picking out the specific content that's being displayed. So I wanted to offer some pointers as far as what to look for, what it is that you're seeing, and the mechanism by which it is appearing to you. So the first thing I would do is call your attention to the process of tracing water currents with dye. You can go check this out on YouTube, I'm sure, somewhere. Basically, the idea is inside of like various pneumatic system that runs on water pressure, water currents. Say, for instance, in the ocean or some shit, in a smaller system, you can put dye inside the water and it'll show you which way the current is flowing. The same thing also works in air. If you've ever seen, like, in various kinds of movies where there's a hidden room or something, and it's like a hidden room, and there's an air current that leads to the room, so that's the way that someone has like a little bulb full of powder, and they'll spray it in the air, and they'll kind of follow the current into, like, the low pressure from the hidden room will kind of suck the air towards it, and that'll be highlighted by the dust or whatever they're using to highlight the current. Same thing with the clouds. So the mechanism that's causing it is basically illumination by the sun or other light sources, or topological features of the general area, whether that's caused by natural phenomena, projected scalar potentials of varying sorts, whether that's like something's mental activity or the operation of some form of artifice, is not really germane to the issue. The fact is that you can create a scalar potential over a wide area that will basically give rise to one of these forms. Whether or not that's the intended potential, whether or not it's the intended effect, usually it is, because this stuff is primarily a mode of communication that's used by things that don't really speak language like we do. It's part of the suite of symbolic communications that Talopa would have ascribed to the incorporeal adamantine zucchinis of Udiana. It's like some shit like that. So the main mechanism that's the most fun to watch is the really fast-moving low clouds. And those are the ones that are being animated by all of the processes that I just described. And when you have the sun that's energizing this stuff, it's a lot more detailed, and it's a lot easier to see. And what the sun is doing is it's energizing the water vapor, and it's creating kind of like a pseudoplasma effect. And that's giving this, since it's kind of by the nature of the case rotating, you'll see it do that. You basically get the same kind of gating effect that you would get in a bell-type counter-rotation environment. But obviously using the sunlight illuminated water vapor is going to be a lot less drastic and a lot less harmful to both the environment, the entities that are doing the communication, and the entities being communicated to, naturally. So that's kind of the main mechanism that you're looking at. And so what it's actually doing is it's capturing what is more or less equivalent to a shadow, or like a three-dimensional impression of a space that is not here. You know, think of it like an overlaid parallel world that you can get impressions of by essentially taking negatives of empty space. And the primary things that are doing this would be the beings that would, like in the Indian cosmology, they would be referred to as yakshas, or maybe Gandharvas, Apsaras, Dakinis, things like that. Whoever's moving about in the air. The kinds of forms you'll see are fucking everything, dude. Depending on what is trying to get a hold of you and what the content of your mind is, that's going to generate the experience. But most of the time, just based on who's around using that stuff, you're going to see forms that are humanoid shapes, right? That's kind of a big duh. Impressions of faces and hands, primarily. And also general body outlines of known forms along the lines of things that would appear during the Dzogchen Togal visions. Forms of deities, implements, basic mandala shapes, things like that. That's like one class of phenomena, and that's basically under the category of like a tutelary deity that's appearing to show you something. And it would typically be something that you're either doing in a meditation practice or something that it's trying to get you to do in a meditation practice. The mode of communication, it's not like, sometimes it's literally writing shit in the sky for you, but that's not going to be a tutelary phenomenon. That's going to be something that's like an alien race trying to get a hold of you, more like. Now, if it's talking to you, chances are that you're not very alien to it. Maybe you know that, maybe you don't. But, well, now you found out. Great job. So, the other kinds of phenomena that you can see up there are things that resemble architecture. Particularly the kind of angular geometries that indicate structure. And in this case, typically they'd have kind of like an edge. You're looking at like the edge of a building. And then there's also things that look like stupas and stuff like that. So, when you get to that level, you want to start being able to pick out the various architectural forms that are repeated often. This is actually something that appears very much in the rover photographs from the Mars rovers, which will give you a hint as to where this shit comes from, or at least one of the last places in which it reached a sufficient pitch to be conserved and thence reproduced here. Now, those typical forms are something I call like balls and bumps, which is indicative of a kind of finial style that was used heavily in way back in the planet we're calling Mars, and the kind of other civilizations that were linked to that planet. I'll give you a hint. Mars itself was not really the hotbed of that, at least in the technological sense. It was kind of like a preserve, like this planet was supposed to be. real action as far as high technology was happening on an orbiting body is no longer there. And to the extent it is here, it's more or less like our moon. But hint, hint, that shit is temporal technology. And it is not, it's not really our moon. Or rather, one of its iterations may have ended up as our moon. One of the iterations of that thing ended up being the core of the planet Earth. And when I say iterations, it's literally the same thing. And I know it sounds weird, but you have to think about the temporal technology will cast itself from the point of its creation or the activation along a series of resonant points along a timeline. That's how it works. It basically occupies nodal points on a standing wave, and that's how it basically maintains its integrity in an atemporal fashion. So the same object that was orbiting Mars as an eclipsing body would, farther back in time, be projected to become like the seed around which the planet Earth is formed, and would also kind of become liberated from that planet in another sort of timeline, right? But where we are happens to be a resonant nexus of all of those events in a kind of a particular output form, which we would, I guess, term as highest entropy, in the sense that it's the form in which everything is basically as shattered as possible to give the maximum amount of leeway and freedom of action as far as reconstructing things. So the styles that you'll look for, again, start with stupas and start with basic kind of polygonal forms. In particular, you're going to look for hexagons, sets of triangles, and the circular kind of swirling activity, not unlike the thing called a gyankil in Tibetan Buddhism. They call it a bliss swirl. Kind of like that. You want to look for areas of vorticular activity because those are going to clue you in on the emergence of scalar phenomena. So when you kind of get this basic syllabary down about what these things are using to communicate with you, then I would suggest perhaps taking a study of various kinds of ideographic writing forms. Stuff like tomkas, not tomgas, not tonkas, but tomgas, in this kind of Western / Central Asian steppe sense, like the things the Scythians or Mongols were using as forms of symbolic communication that weren't quite writing, but were kind of like hieroglyphs. And while you're at it, go look at Egyptian hieroglyphs. Look also at their kind of conservation or redaction of the Phoenician syllabary, because that's going to give you the basis of a kind of simplified mandala activity, really, is what it is the generation of physical forms through repeated sound. And when you say repeated, it was really like infolded. So the repeated periods of vibration in a medium is going to, over time, actually arrange longitudinally relative to our space here. So it'll basically unfold in time, right? it's kind of how you generate the vindus or the seeds that are the basis of the technology that was discussed in the W56 case. Because those friends are basically those are the guys you want to talk to. The other guys, the CW or whatever, I forget what that Italian gentleman was actually calling the opposing force, but that was a stream of kind of oppositional thinking. It wasn't really oppositional, it was different than the W56. You can think the W56 are basically like bodhisattvas with spaceships. And the other guys are like fucking asuras or some shit. Like, they're really into high technology. They're all about it. And they're trying to get to where they don't have to do a lot of moral cultivation in order to access the benefits of basically the mode of living that a siddha has, which is like fecundity in every sense of the word, like at hand, at will, all the time, without really realizing that whole experience kind of arises out of an accepting of emptiness and not giving a fuck what happens. Now that's a hard viewpoint to accept for most people, especially ones that are inclined to technological thinking. So you're gonna find it very hard to get a scientist to accept a viewpoint like that. However, you won't find it very hard once you can really get them to accept the legitimacy of work of people like Reich and Richter, because Reich figured out that basically the P.B. Randolph model of sex magic is more or less able to generate significant amounts of energy via condensed electromagnetic fields, that you can actually use it to power things. And that's the fucking secret of the model of the siddhas, actually, is that that's the bodhicitta, like the energetic, almost elemental form of that energy, more almost like the will to live, but more like the will to enjoy. That is kind of like the power source for all of that technology. Because once you really get in there, you realize that the main feature of it is interacting with the aggregate information systems that basically correspond to the world around you in a way that not necessarily imposes upon them, but draws out of them an emergent form of consciousness that is also trying to enjoy things. And then you basically treat it like your girlfriend, and you give it the Doctor Who pitch. You're like, hey baby, let's fucking travel the universe. And the answer is going to be yes, if you do it right. The other part of that is Dr. Ronald Richter, who is basically the holdout from the kind of Nazi Bell days that ended up being alive and able to conduct experimentation in the open in the I guess under the auspices of Juan Perón's government. He got lampooned and made fun of in the scientific press at large, but in secret the Air Force was like, dude, this guy's on some shit. And they were looking very, very closely at his work. And again, he was using counter-rotating electromagnetic fields pulsed with high amounts of AC and DC current, just like the Bell was doing. And you can think of that as additional layers of counter-rotation. And this whole idea was how to stretch the medium of space itself thin enough to where you could, like, not break, but bend the cellular structure such that when it released the bending action, it would release an amount of energy that was significantly more than what you put into it. So it's a kind of, it's not a, in a sense, it's a free energy machine, but you have to invest a lot. And what you get out of it is variable because it depends much more than is thought on like the time in which it happens. This stuff is all very context dependent, and the thing about the particular form of artifice that I'm pitching here is that it makes everything context independent. The only context is the reference point of the incident consciousness that's using it, and that's really the fucking ticket, and that's the Doctor Who shit.